I'm here where they're searching for little Gus Lamont yet again. Many people are asking the same question. Why have they resumed the search now? Either way, the push to find Gus is back on, and slowly but surely, the details of Gus's family are being pulled into the spotlight. It's understood that Josh only found out that his son was missing after police woke him up at his Belaley North farmhouse hours after Gus had gone missing.
Search resumed at Oak Park Station with roughly 80 Army personnel and several police officers. When authorities announced the renewed ground operation at Oak Park Station, it marked a deliberate and costly decision. Bring experienced boots back onto a landscape that had already been combed, and do it with enough people to sustain long hours in extreme conditions. The presence of around 80 Australian Defence Force personnel alongside state police and volunteer search crews signaled two things at once: urgency and a recognition of how big the challenge had become. Military teams bring stamina, logistics, and specialized search training. They can walk long grids, transport equipment to remote points, and support aerial work with ground confirmations. Police contribute investigative oversight, witness canvassing, and the legal framework to collect and preserve any evidence. Together, these teams operate differently than ad hoc volunteer line searches. They organize shifts, map sweep lines, record every coordinate, and log every footprint or item found. That level of organization is essential in a case where the argument between hope and realism is decided by inches of sand and minutes of daylight. Putting large numbers of personnel back into the field is also a practical admission. The initial searches did not yield the clarity investigators had hoped for, so more resources were necessary to revisit areas, re-examine earlier findings, and apply different techniques. That's the usual arc in complex missing person cases. Initial urgency followed by methodical rechecking that sometimes requires a fresh set of eyes and new equipment. On the ground, the renewed operation meant long patrol lines, repeated sweeps over the same tracks, and careful coordination so that vehicle movements, aerial scans, and foot patrols didn't inadvertently erase or confuse subtle traces. Rather than a single dramatic breakthrough, these teams aim to reduce uncertainty, narrow improbable scenarios, confirm or disprove early impressions, and build a precise timeline from the available evidence. This kind of work is slow and painstaking. It asks the public for patience even as it asks the family for the courage to keep hope calibrated to facts. Oak Park Station spans about 150,000 acres of remote sheep farming land. To grasp the scale of the search, it helps to picture the land. Oak Park Station is not a backyard or a suburban park. It is a working sheep station that stretches across tens of thousands of hectares. Describing it as roughly 150,000 acres is not hyperbole. It's a measure of how much ground must be considered when even a small initial search radius becomes a labyrinth of scrub, sand ridges, fence lines, and dry creek beds. On a property of that size, the homestead is a small island of human activity amid enormous stretches of terrain where visibility and landmarks are few. Distances that would be a short walk in town can be disorienting in such an environment. A 4-year-old wandering a few hundred meters can quickly lose bearings, and from above, the ground often looks like repeating patterns: rust-colored earth, pale spinifex, and the same low scrub over and over. That scale also complicates logistics. Transporting people into search zones requires fuel, vehicles capable of handling soft sand and scrub, and careful coordination to avoid causing more damage to fragile tracks. Communication becomes harder the further teams move from homesteads with telephone or reliable radio coverage. The property's size amplifies every search planning decision: where to place command posts, how to rotate teams so exhaustion doesn't set in, and how to document each sweep so nothing is accidentally duplicated or overlooked. It also influences public perception. It's easy for those watching coverage to underestimate the sheer physical breadth of the area and to be impatient when a missing person isn't found quickly. In truth, even the most systematic search across 150,000 acres can leave blind spots, and that recognition explains why authorities sometimes return to the same property weeks later, not because they missed something obvious at first, but because the land itself hides small traces and reshapes them with wind and weather. Initial search radius around the homestead expanded from 2 kilometers to approximately 5 kilometers. Early in any disappearance, the instinct is to begin close to where the person was last seen, and the initial radius for Gus's case was understandably modest. A couple of kilometers around the homestead seemed a logical first sweep. But as days passed and the investigation progressed, authorities broadened that radius to roughly 5 kilometers and, in some stages, to an even wider area with aerial and technological support. That expansion is not a sign of disorganization. It is a pragmatic response to both uncertainty and the patterns of human movement. Small children do not maintain consistent directions when they wander. They follow curiosity, shade, and repeated calls. Their paths can be meandering and short, or, with dire and unlucky timing, lead them toward hazards further out. A 5-kilometer radius around a homestead covers a vastly larger ecological and logistical swathe than a 2-kilometer circle. It includes additional water sources, tracks, fence lines, and even neighboring paddocks that might contain the one piece of evidence that cracks the case. Expanding the search also lets investigators overlay other data. The likely speed a small child could cover over time, vehicle tracks that might have passed through the area, and the points from which local residents could have seen or heard something. Expansions are typically deliberate. Teams map where earlier sweeps occurred, which corridors the child could feasibly walk in daylight, and where the difficult terrain begins. That mapping then guides where to bring in specialist resources, thermal imaging at night, drones with greater range, and mounted trackers. It also means that captures of potential traces in the wider radius must be assessed carefully to separate relevant impressions from noise. In short, the step from 2 to 5 kilometers is a geometric jump in complexity, and it reflects investigators' need to leave no reasonable stone unturned even while knowing the odds shift with every passing hour. Terrain is featureless, sandy, and scrubby, causing vehicles to become separated or damaged. It is easy to overlook how much terrain itself shapes an investigation. The landscape at Oak Park Station is primarily sand, low scrub, and open paddock, not dramatic cliffs, not dense forest, but large areas that look deceptively uniform. That uniformity is a challenge. It gives little in the way of landmarks, and subtle traces like small bare footprints or scattered clothing can be erased quickly by wind or the revolving traffic of search teams. Vehicles operating in soft sand face mechanical stress, tires sink, axles strain, and undercarriages can be damaged on hidden ruts. That reality has forced search organizers to split forces into mixed teams. Foot patrols that can feel the ground closely, and vehicle teams that can move supplies and support wider sweeps. But vehicles often must remain on established tracks to avoid getting bogged or causing further destruction of possible evidence. Sometimes vehicle convoys have to separate so foot teams can push into thinner scrub, which creates coordination challenges and increases the risk of missed lines of sight. Weather compounds the problem. Hot, dry winds can lift a thin veil of dust that then settles into impressions, softening edges and making footprint analysis difficult. Evening temperatures drop quickly, changing both the ambient noise and the movement patterns of animals. These environmental rhythms mean that search teams must be doubly careful about how they approach and record each area. They also explain why repeated sweeps across the same ground, sometimes by different teams using different techniques, are so important. What looks unremarkable in the morning can reveal faint traces after a wind change, or in the cooler hours when the ground holds impressions longer. All of that makes the search physically punishing, logistically complex, and psychologically draining for those involved. Gus vanished from a sandpit near his grandparents' homestead on September 27th, around 5 p.m. The family timeline is the central axis around which every other question turns. According to family accounts, Gus was last seen playing in a sandpit near the homestead around 5 p.m. on that September afternoon. By roughly 5:30 p.m., when his grandmother called him inside and could not find him, the family had moved from casual searching to intense worry. They searched the immediate area for hours themselves before notifying police, and that gap has been a focus for investigators and the public because minutes matter so much in missing child cases. A small child can be exposed to hazards, heat, water, animals, that escalate rapidly, and when time passes before formal search resources are mobilized, the window for finding clear, fresh traces narrows. But the timeline also reflects the raw human response of a family in a rural setting. People searching their own land are not always in the mindset to call police immediately. They may search first, hoping to find the child quickly and quietly. That instinct is understandable, and investigators take it into account while still pressing for objective details. Who checked which areas? How thorough were those initial searches? And what was the family's exact chronology of movements? Piecing together that sequence is not about blame. It's about mapping the probable positions and timings so search teams and detectives can align physical evidence with witness accounts. Every step in that reconstruction, when a gate was last closed, whether a vehicle left the property, what calls were made, becomes a small but necessary tile in the mosaic investigators must build to move from speculation toward conclusion. A footprint and clothing identifications were noted, but produced no conclusive lead. Early in the searches, volunteers and professionals logged several small clues. A partial footprint near the homestead, impressions in the sand that some thought might be barefoot marks, and reports of clothing resembling the child's. Each of these discoveries raised hopes and also immediate questions about provenance and reliability. In rural searches, a footprint can be persuasive or deceptive. The same mark might be a degraded boot print, an animal track, or simply a weather-pressed cavity. Likewise, a scrap of fabric can belong to a passerby, a hunter, or a previous resident. Investigators photographed and cataloged these items, aiming to test their relevance against forensic standards. Those steps are painstaking. Photographs must be calibrated, items must be collected without contamination, and any witness description of clothing must be corroborated with reliable evidence. Over time, though, none of these early items produced the direct link the investigation needed. The footprint that once looked promising was reevaluated and judged unconfirmed, and clothing notes did not match conclusively to the child's wardrobe in a way that could guide a search corridor. That doesn't make the initial findings irrelevant. It simply reflects how messy outdoor evidence can be. Every early lead must survive stringent verification, and many will not. The absence of a smoking gun object, a hat, a shoe, a toy, has pushed investigators away from search and rescue protocols that focus on immediate recovery and toward more formal investigative work that asks who is nearby and what movements were recorded in the hours around 5 p.m. That transition is difficult for a family and a community eager for answers, but it is also the careful, methodical path that preserves the integrity of whatever conclusion is eventually reached. Police now characterize efforts more as a recovery operation than an active rescue. Language matters in public communications, and the shift in terminology from rescue to recovery or investigation is not merely rhetorical. It reflects how the probabilities in the case are being assessed. Early on, when resources are mobilized to maximize the chance of finding someone alive, authorities frame efforts as search and rescue. That posture emphasizes speed, widespread volunteer involvement, and immediate, aggressive ground sweeps. When the balance of evidence grows less optimistic, after exhaustive searches yield little or no fresh physical trace, police often pivot to an investigative stance. In Gus's case, the formation of a dedicated task force and the description of activities as recovery-focused indicate that detectives are placing greater emphasis on forensic review, witness interviews, intelligence analysis, and slow, methodical canvassing rather than purely time-critical rescue maneuvers. This shift has practical consequences. Investigations typically require stricter scene preservation, more formal chain of evidence handling, and a longer-term allocation of detective resources. Investigators may revisit the family's timeline in detail, re-interview neighbors and passers-by, examine vehicle movements, and trawl digital records for inconsistencies or overlooked patterns. The public often interprets the change in language as a sign that hope is fading, and that reaction is understandable. But police also try to be careful. A recovery-oriented approach does not mean the case is closed or that efforts to find the child alive have ceased. It means that the next steps are more forensic than frenetic, designed to build a legally sound account of what happened rather than to chase every improbable possibility. Family dynamics and privacy attracted intense attention, including delayed release of Gus's photo. When a child vanishes, Public interest is immediate and intense, and that spotlight inevitably touches the family. In this case, questions about who was where that afternoon, how the family searched, and why certain decisions were made became public very quickly. At the same time, the family's desire for privacy and the need for authorities to verify facts before releasing images and details created tension with a public hungry for specifics. The delayed release of a confirmed photo of Gus was widely discussed. Some saw it as a protective measure, others as an unnecessary delay. Both perspectives have roots in legitimate concerns. Families living through trauma often need breathing room and careful handling of information. Investigators need to avoid premature disclosures that could contaminate witness memories or investigative leads. That tension is part of a larger conversation about how media and the public interact with private grief. The family's movements and personal history are not public performance. They are elements of a painful reality that must be treated with dignity even as the press and the public press for answers. For investigators, balancing transparency with privacy is a delicate task. Release too much and you risk complicating inquiries. Release too little and you fuel suspicion and rumor. Most agencies try to walk that line by providing confirmed facts at measured intervals while urging the public to respect the family's space. That plea for empathy is not meant to quash legitimate scrutiny. It is meant to acknowledge that the human beings at the center of any missing person case are living through a hardship that public curiosity can make worse. Social media misinformation and AI-generated content circulated widely, complicating the investigation. One of the most modern challenges in any high-profile missing person case is the torrent of online content that blooms in its wake. In Gus's disappearance, false images, fabricated leads, and AI-generated photos spread rapidly, forcing police and fact-checkers to spend time debunking fake claims rather than following up on credible tips. The speed and reach of that content matter. A single false sighting or manipulated image can trigger dozens of fruitless phone calls, pull volunteer time away from organized searches, and muddy the public's understanding of what is actually known. Fact-checking organizations quickly flagged hoaxes and clarified that police had not confirmed many of the circulating claims. Authorities repeatedly urged people to avoid sharing unverified material and to direct any real evidence to official channels. Misinformation also has a human cost. For a grieving family, seeing distorted images or sensationalist narratives about their child can be cruel and disorienting. For investigators, distinguishing signal from noise becomes more laborious, and every false lead costs precious time and attention. The problem is not unique to this case, but its impact is amplified by the remoteness of the scene and the lack of clear, objective physical evidence that would otherwise anchor public understanding. Responsible sharing, patience, and reliance on official updates are small but meaningful ways the public can help keep the focus on credible leads and spare investigators and family unnecessary distraction. Experts consider natural causes like dingoes, eagles, or crocodiles highly unlikely given local conditions. When a child disappears in the bush, instinctive hypotheses often include wildlife, dingoes, eagles, snakes, or other regional predators. Those theories circulate quickly because they offer a simple explanation that fits a public narrative about the dangers of the wild. But experienced trackers, local volunteers, and some officials cautioned against leaping to those conclusions in this case. Their assessments rested on practical observations about the local fauna, the lack of disturbance typical of animal attacks, and the kinds of evidence animals leave behind: torn clothing, drag marks, blood traces, or clear signs of a scuffle. Seasoned searchers familiar with the property reported that wedge-tailed eagles, feral pigs, or pack dogs were not present in numbers or behavior patterns that would make a sudden, untraceable disappearance likely. That doesn't categorically rule out every natural cause, but it does push investigators to balance wildlife hypotheses with the uncomfortable possibility of human involvement or removal. Experts also point out that the environment itself, hot, dry, and featureless in sections, is somewhat inhospitable to certain animals that might provide easy explanations. Crocodiles, for example, are not endemic to the region around Oak Park Station, and large raptors have physical limits that make them unlikely to carry a small child for any distance. Those grounded biological realities narrow the field of plausible explanations and again bring attention back to timelines, human movements, and the footprints and impressions that remain the case's most enigmatic clues. The conclusion from most experienced observers is sober. Natural causes are not impossible, but given the evidence, or lack of it, they are less likely than some other scenarios, which is why investigators are methodically following up all leads rather than settling on a single, comfortable narrative. Wrap up. The search's restart signals persistent concern despite dwindling actionable leads. What this renewed effort ultimately represents is not finality, but persistence. Authorities have returned to Oak Park Station with organized, well-equipped teams because uncertainty remains, and because the family and community deserve exhaustive work even when the odds are grim. The terrain, the enormous property size, and the fragile quality of outdoor evidence make every minute of the search and every footprint examined matter. The shift toward recovery-focused investigation, the scrutiny on family privacy, the flurries of misinformation, and the expert assessments about wildlife each narrow the field of plausible explanations, but none answer the central question. Where did Gus go? If you care about this case, the most useful actions are simple and concrete. Share only verified information, pass any real tips to police, and keep the family's humanity at the center of public conversation. Authorities ask for cooperation, patience, and credible leads. The community asks that Gus not be reduced to a headline. Until every footprint is explained, every timeline reconciled, and every credible lead exhausted, this story is not finished. Keep asking questions. Keep looking for facts. Keep Gus's name alive.
Dozens of Defence Force personnel have packed up and left as police pull the pin on their latest outback search for South Australian boy Gus Lamont. As Lauren Rose reports, it's been almost 3 weeks since the little boy vanished from his home, seemingly without a trace.
First and foremost, our thoughts are with Gus and his family. We would love to have resolution to this matter, but not any more than the family with themselves.
It's the end of the road for authorities here today. They've thrown everything at this latest search, but there's still no sign of 4-year-old Gus Lamont.